Thank you so much for joining us as we share these best practices for developing a statewide LCRR program. With the EPA releasing their recent compliance updates, we understand there's a lot of information to unpack for both states that are setting up these programs and utilities that are anxious to understand how to best set up their programs. So we're hoping to shed a lot of light on that today, and we'll be sharing how utilities can get started today, even as they await final guidance from states. My name is Isaac Peller, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing here at 120. Megan is the co-founder and CEO of 120Water, a data and software veteran. Prior to founding 120, she spent 15 years as an executive building and scaling various software and service products in the Midwest. With a passion and knowledge for utilizing modern software technology to solve problems, 120Water provides modern software and tools necessary to solve our most complex drinking water challenges. So welcome, Megan. I'm going to turn it over for you to dive into this content.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac. I appreciate it. And we have a lot of content, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. And I just want to reiterate, there are chat features, there's a Q&A feature, so please don't hesitate to get your questions or comment logged or concerns logged in that feature. And if we don't get through them today, we'll be certain to get through them and follow up with you afterwards. But as Isaac mentioned, I am co-founder and CEO of 120Water. One of my roles here at 120Water is to not oversee operationally certain functions such as product, but I have the pleasure of working directly with customers, and oftentimes our statewide and very large customers that are implementing a lot of these programs for the first time, and the need to manage a lot of data for the first time, and the need to have that data work for them either to achieve public health or compliance outcomes. And love bringing new programs to life and sharing best practices. And so we thought it would be a first for us to get kind of both our water system customers and our state customers, and even just those who are interested in hearing what are some of the best practices that we've not only found implementing in the trenches as we built these inventories for our customers, but then also how are those programs being rolled out at scale and implemented at the state level. So super excited to kind of share our findings so far with you. A little about 120 if you're not familiar with who we are and what we do. So we are a water platform, and that platform is software that's managed in the cloud. It's consumables such as water testing kits, validation kits, as well as remediation kits. And we have a services team, and all of those things come together to help our customers who are water systems as well as regulators execute programs, water quality programs, particularly lead programs. So to date, we've done a lot of them, over 300 utility sampling events so far. We have over 1 million sample locations that's managed under our entire portfolio, and over 3 million service lines inventoried on behalf of our customer base, which is currently over 400 customers across 39 states. So we've probably seen about every flavor, as you can imagine, of lead program management and execution and results out there, whether that be for facilities or directly with water systems. Okay, so just a little bit of a level set of what we know. We actually planned this webinar before the EPA guidance came out, so it was kind of fun to go back and weave that guidance into our programming for today. But what we know so far is that the compliance date for LCRR continues to be October 16th, 2024. And those preliminary inventories are due by then, and we'll talk a little bit about the work in progress and best practices in order to get all that data reported by that time frame. We also know, and the EPA guidance did reinforce this, that there are additions to the LCRR called improvements, lead and copper rule improvements, that are expected around that October 16th date so far. There are a few areas that they have been noted for improvement, and obviously we will keep everybody apprised as we know more. Many of you on this call generally know before we do. But again, we will keep our ears and eyes to the ground as we hear more on those improvements. And then finally, earlier this month August 4th, the EPA, as promised, did release their final guidance on developing and maintaining a service line inventory. And I think what's interesting about this is they did not waver based on the feedback that they had initially shared, and that they will not be proposing changes to the requirements for the information to be submitted in the initial service line inventory. So what is written in the rule and how that is laid out is what will be the requirement for that initial inventory period of October 16th, 2024. They did, however, open the door for potential changes for those inventory updates after this year. So that will be coming, that could be coming as part of the improvements. I think it's important to note that states have the opportunity to basically make these rules more stringent than the federal requirements. And as always, I encourage you to make sure that you understand your state regulator guidance. They are going to have the best and final guidance. We certainly aim to provide the most up-to-date information that we have, but at the end of the day, your state regulators are going to have the best and final guidance for the implementation and execution of this rule. Okay, so speaking of the rule, this hopefully is a little bit of just a refresher in terms of a bit of the components that have changed and that will be required. For the purpose of today's conversation, we are going to really be focusing on the inventory development and the data compliance, because that is the first phase of the implementation of LCRR and the first thing that we have to do. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what's involved with building that inventory, the data compliance requirements. But as a reminder to what has to happen once that inventory is built, there's a new sampling methodology. So for lines that are identified as lead or unknown, you will be required to take a 1st and 5th liter sample. There's also a new trigger level that has been introduced, actions that have to occur both at 10 parts per billion and 15 parts per billion. There's an interesting find and fix provision that does go in place. If there is any tap that tests at or higher than 15 parts per billion, regardless of your action level exceedance, you will have to take action on that specific tap. And then the public notifications. There is a series of public notifications that has to happen pre and post sampling, and as you are doing your inventory management best practices that have to happen directly with those locations that are either unknown or lead lines. And then finally, school and child care and facility sampling. We had some pre-questions about some of these items individually, and we definitely have content that we can share with you about these items. We could do a whole chapter on just school and child care facility sampling, and we'll probably get to that. But just want to make everyone aware that for the purposes of this webinar, we're really going to be focusing on implementation of the inventory and data management so that that sets and facilitates LCRR compliance, not only for water systems, but for state regulators as well. And then finally, I certainly don't want to leave out the full service line replacement. Currently, there is no requirement in LCRR unless an action level exceedance occurs or the trigger level occurs, and you have to work with your state regulator on what that appropriate replacement plan will be. I would suspect, although I don't have a crystal ball, that there may be some states that choose to put in some replacement schedules or replacement for the requirements. So let's talk a little bit about that life cycle of implementation, where we are and what that looks like right now. Right now, we're in what we call this inventory development phase. We are working with our systems to develop this robust and comprehensive inventory that can not only be utilized to satisfy the initial requirements, but how do you set up this data set so that it can withstand any future requirements that may occur as part of LCRR or other water quality or infrastructure demands in the future. So right now, that's gathering data, building these inventories, and validating these inventories. 2024 and beyond is really about reducing and monitoring the lead that's in the ground through tier sampling, communication and reporting, and replacements. It is cyclical, it is never ending, and it is really meant to be a continuous improvement and turning those unknowns to knowns, identifying that lead in the ground and the replacement plans to get that out. So let's talk a little about the steps in that preliminary inventory process that's part of that 2024 compliance date. We always recommend, as part of this inventory development, to go ahead and identify those schools and child care facilities within your distribution system, that you are collecting the data and doing a data management project. So why not go ahead and throw that in there to make sure you are ready to facilitate LCRR sampling and communication, in 2025 and beyond. Beyond that, there are a number of sources, and we'll go into the EPA guidance in a minute of where they recommend, where you just have to do what we call data munging. You have to identify the sources where the data may occur, and you have to have a plan to get that data into a format that you can actually do something with. On average, this takes our customers, and we work with very small customers serving less than 1,000 all the way to those serving close to 1 million. But on average, it basically takes about 50 hours of data management and project work to get that data collected and aggregated and put into a place where you can actually start to make decisions off of that data. So where is that data? This is a really great exhibit, I think, from the EPA guidance, talking about the different types of historical records, what those records can help identify in terms of service line material, and then how they can be used to append to your material and service line records. And you'll notice there are a number of types of historical records that will count towards this record-based preliminary inventory, but they may be all over the place. Fun story, the file cabinet actually picture up there to the left was delivered to the 120Water offices just last week for digitization. So it is not uncommon for systems to have many of their historical records, not only in paper format, but stored away in file cabinets just waiting to be digitized. There will also be digital records within an IT system. Maybe that is one system, but chances are that might be a number of systems, whether that be GIS, billing systems, SCADA systems, any sort of work order or work management systems that you may be using. So again, how do you extract that data from those digital systems, normalize it, and then append it to those location-based records? And then finally, going to external data sources such as plumbing codes, other construction records. And I think the EPA did a really great job, and we can forward this along as state by state. What are some of the national and state-based plumbing codes that can be appended to those locations? And then finally, 120, we've had a lot of success actually aggregating third-party databases that may have really pertinent location-based record information, such as built dates, construction dates, parcel data dates, so that you can bring that into that location to paint a better profile around that location record. So where's the data? It's everywhere. And when we think about how that data has to come together, it has to come together to really follow these statuses. The requirements are pretty clear in terms of what are the preliminary records-based requirements. The inventory must include all service lines that are connected, and that is both public and private, or as they call both system and customer owned. I think one of the most helpful things in the EPA guidance was this grid, in terms of there were a lot of questions of how things were going to be categorized if the system owned portion was non-lead, but the customer owned was non-lead or galvanized requiring replacement. I think this grid does a really great job of how those classifications need to get turned into the reporting requirements to the state regulators and ultimately the EPA. So the service lines must be classified as lead, galvanized requiring replacement, or non-lead, or including the actual material, or lead status unknown service lines, or unknown. And then finally, the classification of non-lead must be supported by evidence-based records, method, or techniques to prove it is not lead or galvanized requiring replacement. I think this is really important because we get a lot of questions from systems that just are newer systems, or systems that just based on their plumbing codes and construction records just do not believe that they have lead in the system. And so, it's great to have some clarification that, there is a process if you believe your system has no lead to have an evidence-based methodology and practice to really validate that, and then work with your regulator to essentially certify that that system is no lead. So it does have to be based though by evidence-based records. It can't be just here's a circle and I don't have lead, but at least it gives us some clarification on what are the types of records that may be required to validate a non-lead system. Okay. And then again, as we all know, the service line needs to be a location-based inventory. So that means including exact addresses with each service line connected, but these do not have to be displayed at the public transparency dashboard. So flexibility of what to display in your public transparency communication. So those are the minimum requirements of what needs to be displayed and reported on an annual basis. But I think the crux and the important thing about all of this is service line management is an ongoing practice, and it needs to be treated as such. And I love this definition from the EPA guidance, which is water systems should treat their inventories as a living data set that is continuously improved over time as the inventory is updated. And that is such a crucial point, I think, in this ongoing discussion about what type of data should we be managing? How often should we be updating this data? How should we be incorporating service line validation programs into our normal course of business? And how often should that be occurring? I mean, it's super important to be thinking about these things holistically because it is continuous improvement. The entire goal is to complete your inventory, turn those unknowns into knowns, understand what those known materials are, and then eventually identify the lead and get it out. And the process doesn't stop until we've completed all of those things. So treating this as a living data set and a living process that gets incorporated into your internal operations and your field operations is going to be a crucial new step that each water system must need to think about. And in order to think about this as a living data set and continuous improvement, you have to think about how you're going to be managing the data over time. And really the only true way to be able to manage that data over time is an electronic database. For some systems that have multiple databases, choosing a system of record, one database in which is the central source of truth for all of this information is going to be the best way to serve you moving forward. Having that real-time information in terms of what are the inventory locations, what is the real-time material data, the ability to memorialize that data and track progress over time will help you facilitate LCRR and replacement and validation moving further. So unfortunately, paper-based record management or even Excel and different versions of Excel, it's going to be very difficult to continuously update this data as part of your ongoing process. And again, being able to electronically monitor that data in one database will also help facilitate LCRR compliance. If I didn't say it once, I apologize, but creating these inventories and as much of this comprehensive data as possible will facilitate lead and copper rule compliance because every single action is based on this inventory data. From the new tier sites that will be created to the communications that have to be sent pre and post and during to the validation that needs to be run on these lines and finally execution of these replacement programs. This data set is your database of record for everything that you need to do with LCR compliance. So getting this and identifying those data pieces, putting it into one system will absolutely help you facilitate LCRR compliance. And then finally, before we kind of move on to state implementation and what we're hearing and seeing there is, why did we start with the systems requirements in terms of rolling out a statewide program? It's because there are a lot of small systems out there. There are a lot of water systems out there, and many of whom probably have never even adopted a data management strategy or don't even really know where to begin. And so when we think about how to take advantage and use this data as a best practice and really to help kind of automate workflows, ensure compliance, and really help both system and regulator, I go back to this phrase that was taught to me when I first started working in data management, which is garbage in, garbage out. And maybe that's a little, I don't know, dramatic or whatnot, but it truly is that we can measure what we track and we can track what we measure, but it has to be good. And it has to be good and accurate and comprehensive data. And I think, the EA guidance really reinforces that by saying, for water systems, a comprehensive and accurate service line inventory will facilitate LCRR compliance, improve lead LSLR program efficiency, provide greater public health protection, potentially assist in obtaining external funds for inventory development and lead service line replacement, and provide cost savings. And then for states, a robust inventory will provide information for oversight and reporting. So again, understanding, defining what's going to be required both at the federal and state level is the first step, but then what additional data points are you going to collect and how is that data going to be reported up is going to be crucial for making meaningful and actionable decisions on that. Okay, so that's at a high level what right now public water systems are doing to get their data in place and the methodology in which that they are using to do and build those preliminary inventories and manage those over time. As I mentioned, we've been having a lot of conversation with states as well, because this is an unprecedented undertaking. When you think about just the lift it takes for one water system, and I am on a lot of calls, I listen to a lot of conversations, and it doesn't matter, again, if you're serving 300 persons or 5,000 or 500,000, the times we hear we just don't even know where to begin. And even if we did know where to begin, we're struggling with the resourcing to actually get the work done. So imagine being a regulator and having to hunt down this data from hundreds and thousands of small and medium-sized systems within their jurisdiction. It is truly unprecedented. And these inventories are the backbone to not only implementation and compliance of LCRR, but the implementation of the funding that is going to be used to not only validate these lines, but also get them out of the ground. So it is crucial that we are thinking about not only how we're going to collect this data, but how this data is going to be reported up at the state level so we can actually drive our future workflows. There is an opportunity, we're going to talk about it, to make this a very transformative data-driven approach. If you want to look at the optimism side of this undertaking, that there is an opportunity here to collect more location-based water system data than ever before. And then finally, again, just to hit home, the magnitude, of the community water systems that will have to submit at least one preliminary inventory, that's about 96.8% of those serve less than 10,000 people. So, larger systems, it's a massive undertaking and such, but it's a lot of the small and medium-sized systems where the data collection has to be so intuitive, so easy, and the assistance has to be so approachable that the data makes it in and we can complete these inventories and do the work that's needed. So this is a little bit of data that across our customer base, when we talk about what is the massive resourcing and financial burden that these programs take. So again, majority of systems don't really know where to begin. The guidance is helpful, and I think we have a little bit better idea of where to begin now, for sure. But the work is the work to actually apply that guidance and training. So, again, on average, it takes systems about 50 hours to develop their preliminary inventories. That does not include validation of every line. It may include a little bit of validation, but primarily it's just the records-based preliminary inventories. Once those records are in the system, it generally takes between $300 and $800 per location to validate a service line in the field. So when we are working with validation plans with our customers, all validation techniques are not created equal. And so there may be some prioritization needed based on how much budget is given to actually validate those lines in the field. And that's where we get into what are the leading and lagging indicators. So for instance, we do use predictive intelligence to help prioritize the work in the field. But again, that is not in itself an inventory and a data point that can be used to validate that inventory. And then, finally, the unprecedented communication with homeowners and other stakeholders in order to get data that they have within their resident, but then also that work's going to be done on their property is a continuous life cycle. And our friend Mike Begill, I think, is the best person to speak on this, and he is always educating us and our customers about those best practices. But it is not a triggered event. It really is a plan that water systems have to have at their disposal as they're implementing LCRR. And then finally, back to the resourcing and burden. I mean, the average cost right now, and this was even pre the latest numbers where costs and labor have gone up, is $4,700. If we do the math across all of the lead service lines that need to be replaced, I think we can all agree that the dollars that have been allocated so far are simply a down payment to getting that lead out. And so we really have to be good stewards of the money that's been given to us. And we'll talk about where that is flowing, because there's simply not enough people nor dollars right now to get all of the lead out that needs to get out. So from a state administrative standpoint, the implementation and the hours required to implement this new rule is massive. This is a great guidance, 2019 guidance from ASDWA, basically estimating the impact of the implementation on LCRR, which is about 20,000 hours, 20,570 to be specific, hours annually per primacy agency, with nearly 5,000 hours spent year over year on service line inventory and replacement work alone. You see all the job openings and you see a lot of this wonderful workforce eligible for retirement, and you see the hours and the lift it's going to take to implement this new rule. And, again, this is where I think we have to be sharing creative best practices to help. How do we streamline some of this work? Because there are not enough people to consume all of this work manually. So sharing these best practices and what we need to be thinking about to lessen this burden, and anything we can do to lessen this burden, is imperative. So basically, there are 3 phases of implementation that we are seeing, and I think that this follows really that stepwise best practice from ASWA in terms of how do you eat this elephant, right? How do you really chunk out this elephant so that implementation and being as successful as possible for LCRR is realistic? And this is really no different than how we've maybe helped some of our other state customers phase out certain programs like lead in facilities. And again, how do you test every single child care facility in your state? Well, generally it's a phased and cohort approach, and there's a combination of data management, training, and technical assistance in order to set those programs up for success and resiliency. And really what we're seeing in phase 1 and how states are thinking about this, a couple of ways is first, just establishing that statewide preliminary service line inventory. And that really goes into, again, taking those federal standards, right? Federal standards and guidance, marrying that with any additional requirements that your state's going to have and setting that baseline for what is the mandatory baseline of data that I'm going to require from every single water system in my state. Once we understand what that baseline data is, then we can start to scope out that statewide data management tool that is going to be necessary for us to consume all of that data in one time and hopefully apply some workflows on top of that data to automate some manual tasks and save some of those precious hours that, quite frankly, we probably don't all have in a 24-hour period. And then understanding the water system reporting requirements, right? And how we automate some of those requirements, not only for the administrator, but for the water system. We just got done doing a lot of lead service line reports for a state. And I will tell you, translating that data into those Excel sheets were very, very difficult. And so again, when you think about the lowest common denominator, which are a lot of these small systems that are going to have to find that data, track that data, and continuously update that data, making sure that you have those easy to use and intuitive systems where they can report up is going to be imperative. And then finally, the training and the services piece. How are we going to train? Right? Are we going to virtually train? Are we going to do in-person cohorts? And then what sort of technical assistance beyond the training are we going to implement? So that's really the first scope of planning that's happening. The second scope is really then the validations, the actual work to be done, right? What are those validation plans for those inventories? Because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It may be the most cost-effective thing you can do for a smaller system is go walk and pothole those lines. That may be that right approach for that system. But that's why really understanding what is that preliminary makeup of a system and then coming up with what is that appropriate validation plan per that system to turn those unknowns into knowns. And then develop that replacement plan, right? So once you understand how much lead you have in the ground, then you can actually go out and seek funds to replace that. I have this dotted in green because we're seeing a couple of different flavors of this. And there's no right or wrong. This is the work that has to be done. So there's no right or wrong, but how states are thinking about forming their programs, there are different flavors because there are different needs and different resources per state. But some are thinking, I want to do as much of this as possible, and I want to fold it into a state program. So not only help carry things through the training, but I also want to provide a bucket of validation grants. And those may go through RCAP, rural water, universities, et cetera. But there's a lot of ways to get the work done. But some states are thinking, I have a lot of small systems, so I want to use those dollars available to me to get a plan as validated as possible. And then there are others, a plan is good enough, and then the water system can take that plan and do the necessary ongoing validation work that it's going to take to produce that next work product. So there is no right or wrong. I think the right is whatever is going to get your state and the water systems in your state with the most comprehensive data set available to you by 2024. And then finally, thinking about once we have that data, how can we then use that data to ease the compliance monitoring for LCRR? So the sampling requirements, communications, school and daycare, and eventual replacements. So we're going to talk now about those two components, both the services component and the data management component. We'll start with the data management component. And this is directly from ASDA, their guidance. We always love their best practice and following their best practice. But I think it's important to note that some components of the inventory will have CIDWIZ applications, but will not be enough for the state to routinely track progress and determine compliance with the inventory and the ancillary programs that it impacts. Before the first inventory is submitted, the state will need to have its tracking system in place and have it accessible to impacted programs. As noted above, compliance staff, funding staff, and others will need to access that data. So I think it's important as you're thinking about your data management strategy that there is absolutely a CIDWIZ reporting component. And I believe that there are a handful of things that are going to need to get aggregated up and sent over to CIDWIZ, and that's all well and good. But to consume these living data sets and track that progress over time, both unknowns to knowns, replacement schedules, and so on and so forth, you are going to have to be thinking about the data management and how you're going to routinely track that progress and determine compliance. And you may have existing systems, or you may have to think about how you're going to procure those different systems. And so the first question that we're seeing and the approaches that we're seeing is build versus buy. Do we take, off the shelf software and configure it to meet our needs, or do we hire a custom consulting company to completely build something from the ground up? Again, every state and every state's IT department and procurement department is going to have different opinions on this. And there's not really a right or wrong. Obviously, 120 is a little biased on off the shelf, but the reality is your tech stack better than anybody else. So determining, are we going to build this from the ground up, or are we going to buy something that already exists or that we're perhaps already using for environmental management compliance or GIS or such? The next way you have to think about this is how you're going to be able to consume this data. Are you going to consume it via an electronic reporting tool or a portal? Are you going to give someone an Excel sheet to upload, or both? Because some systems within your jurisdiction may have a robust database and they can just export a file and import it into your reporting tool, and you don't have to worry about them. You may have other systems that do not own an electronic database. So again, thinking about how you need to consume that data and what type of file format to not only consume just the files and the metadata, but also the documents associated with those files and location data to prove the validation of that inventory. So it needs to be flexible data configuration, not only to consume the data today, but the needs of tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So again, the ability to consume not only what is required in these service line inventories, but what else do you want to capture that could be relevant and meaningful to your programs? Is it disadvantaged community information? Is it water loss data? Is it consumer confidence reports, et cetera, et cetera? So a flexible way to consume various different data points from a water system. We're seeing a lot of RFPs out there for automated workflows and logic, which is brilliant and awesome, right? If I have the data, how can I have the data work for me, right? Things like on the submittal process of those inventories, making sure there are mandatory fields that are normalized to fit the standard reporting requirements, and kick that data back if it doesn't match those reporting requirements. That's going to save you as an administrator so many hours just trying to normalize data on your end. It comes into your data management tool already normalized so that you can actually just track the progress of that compliance. One important thing that is super important that we are seeing and as a best practice that we have on our inventories are memorializing that reporting. Because again, the only way you can track progress year over year is to set a baseline. And so ensuring that when you're doing that reporting submission, that data is forever memorialized and captured so that you can track progress from one compliance reporting year to the next. Visualizing the metrics that matter, right? So whether that is how many inventories have been supported, how many are submitted, how many more do I need to complete this compliance cycle, and really only focusing on that work, right? So again, how can you see the KPIs that matter to you to get these inventories in compliance and submitted? And then finally, compatibility with CIDWIZ. So again, the ability to extract at the highest level the key points that have to go into CIDWIZ while you have a living, breathing data set that you can use to not only manage the program, but track the progress. think the other thing that we're hearing both at a state and public water system level is the ability then to take these approved inventories and make that available to the public. So again, being able to take this data and once approved, also being able to share that with the public to comply with federal and state reporting requirements. Okay, so those are really the best practices on what we're seeing from and hearing the needs are of the state administrators. And now we'll talk about the varying approaches for technical assistance and some of the creative ways being thought about this. So really, it's about how do you meet the needs of all? And that's really hard. That's really hard. Meeting the needs of all is really, I don't know that that's possible, but I think there are some models of good that can be applied to certain populations that need it the most. I think it goes without saying that just basic training and assistance to that training is just the lowest common denominator, right? But how do you do that in cohorts that may need more training than others? So again, do you parse that up regionally and rely on your rural assistance partners to go in and really help them? Is it in person or is it a virtual? And really, what is the template that you are training to, right? Having that data set in mind, knowing what data set is going to be required, and training to that is also very important to ensure that they can actually leave and start doing something with that training. The second bucket is training plus service line development, right? So I've provided the training and now I'm bringing in a technical assistance provider to assist in the development. And that can literally be anything to tap card scanning, to doing some visual inspections, to doing predictive intelligence, right? And using Rural Water Association, RCAP consultants and universities, again, to provide, a pocket of funds and or technical assistance to really help them get the work done, and really focusing on the cohorts and the population of your state that need it the most. And then that leads us to the training, service line development, and validation. So again, developing the right approach to turn the unknowns into knowns and actually doing the validation work that will lead to developing the lead service line replacement plans. Some systems will be able to put together their replacement plans and submit them, others will not. So again, how are you thinking about the actual boots on the ground or virtual boots on the ground to actually get the data in and the plans created to either validate or replace? And then finally, funding sources to actually get these inventories, these service line inventories created and eventual replacements. So there are multiple funding sources, and I feel like I'm at least in the other category hearing about new sources every single day, but I think the most obvious are the federal funds that are being made available for these programs. Obviously, the first is the bipartisan infrastructure law, so the BIL, USDA, water infrastructure improvements for the nation, the WIN grants, which are primarily focused on lead in schools. Well, not primarily focused, but are most commonly used for lead in schools programs and the remediation thereof. So again, there are federal dollars that are anticipated to flow anytime now, as well as already flowing that can be used on these programs. Then obviously the states. So as we know, much of the BIL will flow through the SRS, but then also how much of the general supplemental fund can go to these programs and particularly go to disadvantaged communities that are most at risk of being left behind. And then we're seeing other state funding sources pop up and grants to the tune of $200,000 to $250,000 or so for first come, first serve. Generally, there's a threshold of population served, but how can you just start to populate the state with a pocket of funds so that these water systems can have the resources to just start the work that has to be done? And then some other resources that we are seeing. So private funds. We're getting ready to actually kick off a joint project with EPIC to do a handful of preliminary inventories across the US. And that is actually funded by a private entity that is earmarked specifically for lead remediation and lead service lines. And so, there are certainly private fundings and sources to help kind of augment some of the federal and state dollars that are flowing to this. Okay, so I have talked way too much. I'm looking forward to any questions that you all may have and any follow-up that I may be able to have with you all. But, again, with all of the work that has to be done, and it's a lot, and again, it's a lot. Every time I talk to a customer and the work ahead, it does seem it does seem at times insurmountable. How am I just going to get this done? But there are models of good. There are techniques. There are proven techniques. There are a lot of good case studies that we can rely on to pick solutions that work for us and to help us kind of eat this elephant one bite at a time. So when we think about what are the transformative opportunities for implementing LCRR, really thinking about an intuitive data-driven approach to continuous and inventory management practices that will ultimately provide the most comprehensive data set to regulators than ever before. I mean, there is an opportunity to be able to know more about the systems in your state than ever before if we do this right. And in turn, help systems better achieve LCRR, the more intuitive and turnkey that we can make their job to find that data, manage that data, and report on that data. Finally, statewide technical assistance opportunities for inventory development should accelerate the deployment of funds. There are, even though it's a down payment, there are a lot of funds that can be deployed in pretty short order once we know where the lead is to remove. And so if we're able to find as much lead or turn as many unknowns into knowns as possible, then we can start deploying those funds. And if we can marry up that data from the water systems to the funding sources of the state and really deploy that faster, all the better. But it will yield cost savings for water systems and ensure that rural and disadvantaged communities aren't left behind. And then finally, the interagency collaboration, not only to fund as many inventory programs as possible, but potentially use that data to glean additional funding opportunities for other programs and other capital programs or other water needs that your state may have. So again, I think with all of the work ahead, there are some exceptionally exciting opportunities and probably more transformative than ever before, or an opportunity that we haven't seen in quite some time. So with that being said, I'm going to take a drink of water, clear my throat, and then Isaac, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to tackle any.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Megan, for sharing this content. And we've gotten a lot of questions, so we're going to get through as many as we can. If there are any that we don't get to, we'll follow up via email with each of you. But so the first question that I want to pose to you, Megan, and you covered it, but I think it's good to kind of double click on this, is just how are small utilities supposed to be able to get this done with minimal staff and trying to get homeowners' cooperation?
I don't think I used this one, but I should have. For any deployment of any of these strategies, there's no silver bullet. There are just lots of lead bullets. And that's one, right? The getting this job done is one, but also getting the cooperation of the homeowner is even a different and isolated and distinct issue. And, all I will say with that is, that is really where technical assistance, at least for the water system, can be, because, taking mundane things off your plate, like digitization of tap cards or getting the data into a system, or again, doing some of the administrative stuff that you don't need to be doing when you really need to be communicating with the public, right? These small systems need to be educating the public about what to expect, what is LCRR, what are the components of LCRR, and that they will be reaching out to them, and they will be doing so in a fashion that is more frequent, that is more relevant, and that's more personal than ever. And so that's where our friend Mike McGill too comes into play. Say, back to this communication strategy, having that communication strategy is just as important as the data that you're putting into your database, because you need data, you need cooperation from every single location that you may have to interact with as part of this rule. So it's a two-pronged approach, right? It's focusing on the work that's high value, but then also having the right plans in place to make sure that the public is on your side. Denver's a great example of that. I think before they ever started to dig a service line, they sent probably at least four pieces of communication to a location, and they held community outreach meetings. They are really an example of good when you think about the level of communication that they actually did before they ever even initiated a validation or replacement program. So I could talk ad nauseum about communication, Isaac, and I'm sure Mike McGill could too, but again, lots of different lead bullets rather than a silver bullet to coordinate all of those.
Indeed. I'll also add that we see a lot of systems working through other projects that they have ongoing, whether that's meter replacement, to also add some of that data in. So using kind of capitalizing on other projects that are going in to ensure that they're capturing that data, or some other strategies that we see systems using.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to that continuous. This is a continuous thing. right? Every location that has a work order needs to have their lead material status, and everyone at any time needs to know whether they need to check it. It just needs to become a standard operating procedure across your utility, for sure.
Yeah. Here's the great question that we have. It's saying that after paper records for service lines have been digitized and that project is complete, what do you suggest for systems where they believe they don't have lead service lines to complete the inventory and to get from that unknown to knowns?
Yeah. So what the EPA guidance did validate is that there are going to have to be records, right, associated with that to really get that certificate, right? I think there's this notion of once you have proven that every single location has a material type and that is not lead, you can kind of test out, if you will, just like we did the asbestos. So I think it's really working when this is where state guidance needs to come into play, working with state regulators to say, okay, what are actually the 5 pieces of data or 3 pieces of data that I'm going to need to show to prove to you I don't have lead in my system, and work hard and fast to do that. Because the sooner that you do that, the sooner that you can kind of graduate into that next phase of compliance and beyond that completed inventory. So I do believe that is where we're going to have to work with our statewide regulators to see what is going to be acceptable records for that presumed non-lead system, and then working hard and fast to go get those and across all your locations.
Yeah, I think that this question kind of dovetails right into that, and it's asking about validation methods. So do you validate a line for inventory by digging it up, or is it done through sampling? So maybe I know the guidance gives some clarification on methods of validating.
Yeah. And again, I think this is where there's not a one size fits all approach. And I really wish there were. I mean, when we were first developing our predictive model, I was really hoping, oh my gosh, we're just going to find it 100% and, yada, yada. But anybody who knows math knows that's really, unfortunately not feasible. So I think, what we are seeing is that larger systems with lots of locations that are unknown, using predictive intelligence to narrow the universe of where I should focus my work to validate is going to be really, really good. And then when you think about the work to validate, look at the PWSA model. And we started working with them in 2016, right? It's a continuous improvement model. They first started by digging everything. That was pretty cost prohibitive. So then they went on and, they started, using CCT and other techniques. And so I think it has to be a system by system approach to figure out what's going to be the most effective and also cost-effective model for validating those lines. We are seeing some interesting promise in new technology, acoustic technology that hasn't really hit the market, but could have some promise. And then there's also a sequential sampling and customer validation as well. We call it tele-engineering, right? Where a customer is able to do, if they have an exposed lead service line in their facility, how do they do self-reporting, right? Or sequential sampling that can be used as an indicator or probability of lead. So again, what's best for your utility is kind of contingent on what does that preliminary inventory say, how much budget and resourcing do you have to devote to it, and then coming up with that right appropriate validation plan that meets the need of your data set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we see across our customer base even them deploying multiple tactics. So
Absolutely.
There's like other ongoing projects like meter replacement. They might be doing some potholing. They're doing also sequential sampling, or they have a customer request program in place that's helping them gather that data as well. So there's certainly a menu of options that can be made available that all play into kind of best practice from a communication standpoint and servicing your customers.
Absolutely.
We have time for 1 or 2 more. So we have this question that says, do I understand that water systems are going to be responsible for the replacement of customer-owned portions of service lines? And does this include indoor plumbing?
That's a great question. So yes, so full service line replacements. So that will only be, those full service line replacements will only be counted towards your replacement objective, if you will, or replacement outcome. So utilities will be responsible for replacing both the public and the private service line. Now, there are exceptions for emergency work and having to go in and replace only one side. But when you think about a service line replacement, only full service line replacements will count towards that replacement goal. Was there another question, Isaac?
Oh, no, I was going to say, even in the guidance, when it talked about if if one side of the line is copper and the other side is lead, it's reported as a lead service line. So kind of the logic behind how what gets reported as a lead line is if any portion of the service line is lead, that is a lead line.
Right. That's right. Now, when it comes to replacing the interior plumbing, that is not part of the requirements, but that's the interesting thing about this find and fix, however, which it's going to be interesting to see how this actually gets rolled out in practice. If it's deemed to be interior plumbing, a water system might suggest an update to plumbing fixtures. We see this quite a bit in our lead in schools, lead in facilities programs when we're doing remediation. If we know that the cause of the lead is actually the fixture, we take that offline and we'll recommend, or the consultant will recommend replacement of that fixture. So that has been a very good best practice with lead in facilities programs, and one that water systems might want to employ as they're thinking about that find and fix and helping their customers better pinpoint where their lead might be coming from.
Great, thank you. We did get a lot of questions. So as I mentioned, we'll be following up. We're going to share this recording. We're going to share the slides with everybody, and we're going to follow up with these questions. I'm going to drop in the chat. Our next webinar next month is going to be with one of our customers, Smyrna, Georgia, who's going to be sharing some of their lessons learned as they've gone through this process. And one of the best things that one of the honors that we have is working alongside our customers, whether that's and just learning from them in aggregate and what's working for these systems across all the states that we're working in. So again, we are very pleased with that. Lastly, I'm also going to just launch a poll. Where is my poll?
Oh, do I need to stop?
There it is. So this is just if there's any additional information that you'd like, or you'd like to speak with someone on our team, please let us know. We'll reach out. And particularly if you're with a state and you need help working through organizing your program, we'd love to have that conversation as well. So I'll leave this open for a couple more minutes, and yeah. Maybe while they do that, we'll do one more question. It says, what do we do if a customer will not let us into their property?
Oh, that's one of my favorite questions. So there is a good faith effort that needs to happen. And that I'm going to go back to the managing of the data, right? And maybe logging that activity so that you are showing a good faith effort that you have tried to reach out to this homeowner across multiple channels and basically get either their consent or their information or et cetera, et cetera. But again, I think that's back to the regulator guidance of, is it 6? I think the DC Water has used a 6-touch good faith effort to reach out to the customer, but then that customer still has to be flagged, or that location rather still has to be flagged of a routinely go back year over year to try to get the work done. Because that may be a transient community where they're only there for 12 months, or it could be someone who's been there for 100 years. But there does need to be a good faith effort, and that needs to be documented, in your database of record.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We'll keep you apprised of future webinars, and we hope you have a great rest of your day, great week, and we're excited to be on this LCRR journey with you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye now.